If you walked into a wealthy Victorian household in 1870 and asked why the 7-year-old boy smelled the way he did, the answer you received would shock you. Not because it was shameful, but because it was completely intentional. The parents were not neglectful. The doctors had prescribed it. The schools had endorsed it. And the entire British Empire, at the very height of its power and sophistication, had decided that bathing a young boy was not just unnecessary, but genuinely dangerous. This is not a story about poverty or ignorance. This is a story about what happens when science gets things spectacularly wrong, and an entire civilization follows it off a cliff without asking a single question. To understand why Victorian boys rarely bathed before the age of 7, you have to understand how Victorians thought about the human body, and that means understanding a medical theory that dominated British and European medicine for most of the 19th century. The theory was called miasma. The word comes from the Greek for pollution or bad air, and the idea was simple and terrifying. Disease, according to miasma theory, did not spread through contact with other people or through contaminated water. Disease floated through the air in invisible clouds of toxic vapor, rising from rotting organic matter, from sewage, from the soil itself, from anything that decomposed or smelled bad. If you breathed miasma, you got sick. If you avoided it, you stayed healthy. This was the dominant medical consensus of the age, and it shaped every decision that Victorian parents made about their children's bodies. Here is where bathing becomes dangerous. Victorian doctors believed that the skin was not just a covering for the body, but an active organ of protection, a barrier between the living self and the poisonous world outside. And they believed that this barrier could be compromised. Hot water, they argued, opened the pores of the skin and left them vulnerable, creating tiny doorways through which miasma could enter the body directly. A child who bathed in warm water was a child who had voluntarily lowered their defenses against the invisible clouds of disease that hung over every Victorian street, every Victorian garden, every breath of Victorian air. The dirt on a child's skin was not dirt. It was armor. Washing it away was an act of medical recklessness that no responsible parent should commit. This was not a fringe opinion held by quacks on the margins of Victorian medicine. This was the mainstream view, published in respected medical journals, endorsed by the physicians who attended the royal family, taught in the medical schools of Oxford and Edinburgh. The doctors who advised Victorian parents were not ignorant men. Many of them were brilliant, dedicated, and genuinely trying to keep children alive in a world where childhood mortality was catastrophic by modern standards. In the 1850s in Britain, roughly 1 in 5 children died before their 5th birthday. Parents were desperate for guidance, and the guidance they received told them clearly that bathing was a risk. But the story is more complicated than simple fear of miasma, because Victorian attitudes toward the child's body were shaped by forces that went far beyond medicine. There was also the question of the soul. Victorian England was a deeply religious society, and the evangelical revival of the late 18th and early 19th centuries had produced a particular theology of childhood that would have profound consequences for how children were raised. The evangelical view held that children were not innocent creatures who needed to be protected from the world. They were sinful beings whose natural impulses were corrupt and who required constant discipline, denial, and spiritual correction to become the kind of upright Christian adults that God and society required. Comfort was dangerous. Pleasure was suspicious. Anything that felt good was probably doing the soul harm. Cold water was different from warm water in this theology. A cold bath, briefly endured, was not pleasure. It was suffering. It was the body being disciplined, the flesh being reminded of its subordination to the will. Many Victorian schools, particularly the boarding schools that shaped the sons of the British elite, used cold baths as both a hygienic measure and a moral one, a daily reminder that comfort was a weakness and that the body existed to be commanded, not indulged. The cold plunge before dawn was a feature of life at Eton and Rugby and dozens of other institutions where the future rulers of the empire were being forged, and it was understood not just as cleaning but as character building. Warm baths, by contrast, were associated with luxury, with the decadent aristocracies of France and Rome, with the kind of softness that had brought down empires. To bathe a boy in warm water was to risk making him weak. The age of 7 was significant in Victorian thinking for reasons that went back centuries. Medieval theology had identified 7 as the age of reason, the point at which a child became capable of moral understanding and therefore morally responsible for their actions. This concept had been absorbed into English common law, into educational practice, and into the general cultural understanding of childhood development. Before 7, a boy was essentially a creature of nature, not yet fully formed as a moral or rational being. After 7, he was a person capable of virtue and vice, ready to begin the serious business of becoming a man. The transition at age 7 was marked in many households by a series of changes in how the boy was treated, what he wore, what was expected of him, and yes, how he was cleaned. Before 7, a boy in a wealthy Victorian household lived primarily in the nursery, under the care of a nurse or nanny rather than his parents. His contact with his mother and father was limited and formal by modern standards. His world was small, domestic, controlled. The nurse who managed his daily life was responsible for his physical care, and the practices she followed were shaped by the medical advice of the age and by the deep conservatism of domestic service, where methods passed from one generation of nurses to the next with very little questioning. If the previous nurse had not bathed the children she cared for, and the one before her had not either, and the doctors confirmed that this was correct, there was very little reason to change. What cleaning did occur before age 7 was not nothing. Victorian nurses did wipe children down, particularly their faces and hands, the visible parts of the body that would be presented to the parents during the brief daily visits that were the norm in upper-class households. The parts of the body that were hidden by clothing were a different matter. The logic here was partly miasmatic, the fear of opening the pores, and partly simply practical. Heating enough water for a full bath in a Victorian nursery was a significant undertaking, requiring servants to carry heavy jugs up multiple flights of stairs to a tin bath that had to be emptied and removed afterward. For a household with multiple children, a full bath for each child every day would have consumed an enormous amount of servant labor and fuel. The economics of bathing shaped the practice as much as the medicine. There is also a class dimension to Victorian bathing that is impossible to ignore. The working class and the poor did not bathe their children because they had no means to do so. There was no running water in the slums of London or Manchester or Birmingham. The water that was available was often contaminated, drawn from rivers and wells that received the runoff of the same streets where people lived and worked. For the poor, the question of bathing was not a matter of medical theory or moral philosophy. It was a matter of survival, and survival meant other things. The middle and upper classes who had the means to bathe if they chose had to construct a rationale for not doing so, and the miasma theory provided exactly that rationale, transforming a practice that the poor had no choice about into a medical recommendation that the wealthy could follow with a clear conscience. The consequences of this approach to childhood hygiene were real and serious, though not always in the ways that modern readers might expect. Skin conditions were endemic among Victorian children of all classes. Impetigo, ringworm, scabies, and a range of other infections that thrive in conditions of poor hygiene were common features of Victorian childhood, treated with various ointments and preparations that often contained mercury, arsenic, or other substances whose toxicity was not yet understood. The irony was profound. The doctors who advised against bathing to protect children from disease were leaving those children vulnerable to a range of conditions that bathing would have prevented, while their remedies for those conditions were often more dangerous than the diseases themselves. The shift in Victorian attitudes toward bathing came gradually, driven by one of the most important medical discoveries of the 19th century. In 1854, a physician named John Snow traced a cholera outbreak in the Soho district of London to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street. His work demonstrated conclusively that cholera spread through contaminated water, not through bad air. Snow's discovery did not immediately overturn miasma theory. Scientific consensus changes slowly, and the doctors who had built their careers and their reputations on miasmatic explanations did not abandon them without a fight. But the evidence accumulated. Louis Pasteur's germ theory, developed through the 1850s and 1860s, provided the theoretical framework that Snow's epidemiology had lacked. By the 1870s and 1880s, the medical establishment was beginning to accept that disease spread through microorganisms, not through vapors, and that cleanliness was a weapon against those organisms rather than a vulnerability to them. The practical consequences for bathing were enormous. If germs rather than miasma caused disease, then the dirt on a child's skin was not protective armor, but a breeding ground for the organisms that could kill them. Bathing was not dangerous. It was essential. The transformation in medical advice was rapid once the theoretical foundation had shifted, and the Victorians, who had always respected the authority of science and medicine, followed it. By the 1880s, the advice in household manuals and child-rearing guides was changing. By the 1890s, daily bathing for children was being actively promoted by the medical profession. The generation of boys who had not bathed until age 7 were now parents themselves, and they were being told to bathe their children every day from infancy. But the change was not instantaneous or universal. The habits of a generation do not disappear overnight, and the deep cultural associations between hardship and virtue, between discomfort and moral strength, between the denial of bodily pleasure and the building of character, these did not vanish simply because germ theory had replaced miasma theory. The cold bath as a character-building exercise persisted in British boarding schools well into the 20th century. The suspicion of too much physical comfort, the sense that coddling a boy was a form of damage to him. These attitudes survived the specific medical justification that had once supported them and found new justifications in the language of psychology and development. The Victorian belief that boys needed to be toughened was robust enough to outlast the science that had first given it medical credibility. What the story of Victorian bathing really tells us is something about the relationship between expertise and culture, about how societies use the authority of science to justify practices that are driven by deeper forces, by economics, by class, by religion, by gender, by the particular anxieties of a particular moment in history. The Victorian doctors who advised against bathing were not cynics or frauds. They were doing their best with the knowledge available to them, and their advice was shaped by the same cultural assumptions that shaped everything else in their world. The boys who went unbathed until age 7 were not victims of stupidity. They were the products of a system of beliefs that was internally coherent and that had the full endorsement of the best minds of the age. The next time you encounter an expert consensus that seems obviously correct, that has the backing of institutions and credentials and the weight of established opinion, it is worth remembering the Victorian doctors standing in their consulting rooms, gravely advising the parents of England that bathing their children was a medical risk. They were confident, they were credentialed, they were wrong, and the boys smelled.